A month ago, when I was looking for a detective novel to read, my search ended up on the top detective novels of all time list, which contained all the obvious stories from Sherlock Holmes to the wonderful works of Agatha Christie. But there was one novel that somehow stood out more than any of those other timeless classics, and it did so because of one Reddit post that absolutely blew me away. The user Azomage wrote, "The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco transformed me into a monk, and everything else he had to say interested me too. Suddenly, I was set on reading this novel. I was ready to get lost in copious amounts of untranslated Latin, scrawling my translations into the margins of the book, immersing myself in the life of a 13th century Catholic monk, and above all, keeping notes of the clues of a thrilling murder mystery, which is a lot for one book. This is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco." So, to begin with, I'm not going to spoil any of the major plot points of this book, except for one that I'm going to kind of allude to. Even though the novel heavily hints at this outcome being a thing, I'm still going to warn you because I think everyone should read this book. And this spoiler has nothing to do with the main mystery of the novel, so I'm not going to spoil anything about the murders themselves, but that's for later. Let's set the scene for our story. Our narrator and chronicler of the story is a young man named Adzo. He joins our hero, a Franciscan monk named Brother William, on a journey to an ancient abbey in the mountains of northern Italy to mediate a meeting between the current papacy and the spiritualists, which is not something that you really have to worry about for this video. On their arrival, they're informed by the abbot, who's the leader of the abbey, that there had been a death the day before they had shown up, and that he'd like them to investigate it due to William's past as an inquisitor. And through the next few days, William and Adzo embark on a journey to discover who the killer is as more people die each day. And let me tell you, that is an intriguing mystery. The setting of the book allows for such an immersive atmosphere that is carried by Umberto Eco's incredibly deep characters, and his characters are absolutely incredible. You might think that all of them being Catholic monks would mean that all of their views are kind of similar, but that couldn't be further from the case. They all have different ways of interpreting their religion, and that conflict comes up in so many ways. In this time period, the Catholic Church was splitting into different groups like the Franciscans I mentioned earlier that Brother William was a part of. But there were also groups like the Benedictines and the Dominicans that all disagreed with each other in some key way. Beyond that, even members of the same order would have arguments, as we'll see later with the argument on laughter later in the video. William has to be one of the best written characters I've ever seen in a novel from a philosophical perspective, and the way his competence is introduced from the very start of the story is incredible. As William and Adzo are climbing up a snow-covered trail to get to the abbey on top of the mountain, they run into a group of monks who are all in a rush. William, without having any prior knowledge of the abbey or anything that's happened there, immediately knows that the monks are searching for a horse. After only exchanging a few words with the cellarer, who's in charge of the finances and he's a pretty important person in the abbey, he immediately knows what they're searching for. And he also guesses the name of the horse, Brunellus, and all of the horse's features as well, which is much to the surprise of everyone there. He even tells them exactly where to find the horse, again, even though he's never actually seen it. Here's what he did know. William saw hoof prints leading away from where he told the monks that they would find the horse, and that one's pretty self-explanatory. But he also used what was stereotypically like a beautiful horse to guess its features, and he knew the horse had to be an important one because the cellarer himself was sent out to find it. If it had just been any old horse, then it wouldn't have demanded that the cellarer had to go find it. It had to be, as William also expertly puts it, the abbot's favorite, which also explains the name. Brunellus, long story short, would be a perfect fit for a horse that was the abbot's favorite. All of this showcases William's ability of deduction straight away. There's no downtime where you have to doubt his capabilities or he has to take forever to prove himself. William is incredible from beginning to end. He's already an established character and takes on the role of the teacher. And he's not written like this for no reason. William honed his ability for deduction when he was an inquisitor long before the events of the story to make it what it is now. And he would also end up regretting that ability later. So he ends up leaving being an Inquisitor behind, which is something we'll bring up later. Now, I will admit that this is one of the most difficult books I've ever read. I already mentioned the untranslated Latin, and at times it does make reading a slog. Echo, through the narration of Adzo, writes like a 13th century monk, for better or for worse, but mostly for better. Between the exciting or tense scenes of the novel, Adzo can drone on and on about whatever historic Catholic event is happening at the time, or tangents about religious ideas that are on topic, or lists. Man, does he love lists. There are lists everywhere in this novel, and in the words of Adzo himself, the list could surely go on, and there is nothing more wonderful than a list, instrument of wondrous hypotyposis. All this can come off as a little dry at times, especially the first 100 pages before the story really gets going. I personally didn't mind much. I thought Echo did a good job of drawing me into the story and immersing me, so the slower bits didn't really bother me as much. I absolutely love this book, and we haven't even touched on the part that I like the most, which is the multitude of deep meanings that are found here. The breadth of different meanings in this book is immense. It tackles deep existential ideas, criticizes the church, and points out what it does well, and above all, shows us the relationship between truth and shame. The main theme of the story. This relationship between truth and shame is something that I had never personally thought of before reading this book. In this story, we see shame everywhere. Shame about relationships with others, shame about relationships with women, which is problematic because these people are clergymen, not to mention shame about being attracted to the same sex. And there's also shame that people have of their own abilities. Throughout the history of the Abbey, people were passed up for being appointed to higher positions within the Abbey, which of course would make them one step closer to the abbot and having control over all the wealth and riches of the Abbey, and you guessed it, the monetary aspect of their religion was also a point of shame. There was even shame of some reflected onto others. There were those in the story who were so ashamed of their peers' interpretation of their religion that they ended up doing horrible things. Even William, who for the most part is an incredibly reasonable and good person, has shame about his past actions as an inquisitor. We see in this story again and again that people's shame leads them to committing moral atrocities. When William was an inquisitor, he disagreed with the methods that were used to get confessions out of people who were accused of heresy. Torture was often used by inquisitors to get people to admit their wrongdoings, and William noticed that people would admit to anything under torture, to the point that it was functionally useless in finding the truth, saying, "There's only one thing that arouses animals more than pleasure, and that is pain." Under torture, you say not only what the inquisitor wants, but also what you imagine might please him, because a bond, this truly diabolical, is established between you and him. These things I know. I also have belonged to those groups of men who believe they can produce the truth with white-hot iron. Well, let me tell you, the white heat of truth comes from another flame. In this, William is trying to point out that people aren't perfect, and just as how regular people sin, so do saints. There, now you know. This was the thought that struck me in the course of my inquisitions, and this is why I gave up that activity. I lacked the courage to investigate the weakness of the wicked, because I discovered they are the same as the weaknesses of the saintly. William left his position as an inquisitor because he saw that in the desperate pursuit of trying to find the truth and rooting out heresy, that inquisitors who were trying to find that truth were only convincing their prisoners to lie through torture. If truth needs to be found, it needs to be approached willingly. The more you try to force out the truth, the more the world shows you lies. It's like a paradox. The more I try to know, the less I really do know. And William admits that all he does know is that he knows nothing, cue in Socrates. And speaking of inquisitors, I have to introduce you to the character of Bernard Guy. Guy shows up a few days into the story as the representative of the current pope, and is by no means friendly with William or the spiritualists. Now, the fact that he shows up after the initial murders clears him of being the murderer himself, but by no means does that make him a good person. In fact, it's quite the opposite. This guy sucks. Even before he gets there, his reputation precedes him. William is clearly very concerned about Guy arriving. He already considers Guy to be a horrible person even before you, as the reader, see anything that he's done. And when Guy arrives, all hell breaks loose. Guy finds out about the murders that happened in the Abbey and takes it on himself to deliver justice and bring order back to the Abbey. But Guy isn't driven by the kind of truth William is driven by. No, Guy is driven by shame. Guy finds two people who are sneaking women into the Abbey at night, and accuses them baselessly of being the murderers. After having them tortured, Guy has a trial for them that is clearly a complete sham. Guy slowly and methodically breaks down his victims, exploiting their own shame to eventually cause them to completely collapse mentally, and he does it all for his own enjoyment. I was initially dreading rereading this part of the book for this video because this part of the book is harrowing. Guy and the accused are not on equal terms. A common tactic used by the torturers during the time was to never have the Inquisitor present during the interrogations. That way, when the accused sees the Inquisitor for the first time, they see them as this savior from the awful hell that the torture was, and they're much more likely to confess everything that the Inquisitor asks them to confess to. These kind of tactics were used very often by Inquisitors at the time, and all on unsuspecting and unprepared victims. Historically, the accused were rarely knowledgeable about how the Inquisitors worked, and most of them weren't even clergymen. And even if someone there did know better, they still wouldn't stand up for the accused, because they knew they'd be next. Who would support a heretic, after all? This let the Inquisitor do pretty much whatever they want. Guy uses every kind of logical fallacy to emotionally manipulate the accused, who, as a reminder, is completely broken during the trial and unable to represent themselves at all. And during the proceedings, when the accused is at his most frantic and is openly admitting to a crime he did not commit to avoid further torture, Guy smiles. Beyond that, Guy seems to enjoy the whole proceeding. He uses it as an act to, in the name of his religion, indulge his own shame as a sadist. Now, I can't say for sure, partly because he's a book character, but I can't say for sure that he's exactly conscious of what he's doing. Shame distorts reality for the person it affects. Bernard Guy could have actually thought what he was doing was righteous, that he was doing God's will, that he was bringing dark things into the light in finding truth, but really, he wasn't. He was using truth as an excuse to indulge his own shame. And truth and shame are opposites. Truth is the antipode to shame, and so long as shame is present, truth can't be found. But to understand that, I think I need to explain exactly what I mean by truth. William didn't always believe that truth existed, and he certainly didn't believe that truth was always evident. William's views on truth are quite frankly fascinating. I only ever wrote down one quote from the book that wasn't a translation or a clue to keep track of, and that was a quote by William when he was crossing the veil of the unknown to confront a murderer whose identity was still not completely known to him, and he said, "We must, that is all, even if we comprehend imperfectly." William didn't believe in rushing decisions in the name of the truth like Bernard Guy did. He wasn't obsessed with knowing something perfectly. He knew that it was impossible to do so. No matter how much you know, there's only so close you can get to the truth. And William exhibits this idea plenty of times throughout the story. While others in the abbey are quick to condemn the other monks and even themselves for their shame, William forgives. The two people I mentioned earlier that Guy falsely accuses of being the murderers, William had met with earlier and had already forgiven them. Everywhere he goes, William admits that he knows less than there is to know about anything, and it's this admission that makes him the perfect investigator. As he learns more and more about the murders in the abbey, he takes only what is known to him and only makes mistakes when he makes the few assumptions that he does. In fact, there are only 2 times when William makes mistakes: when he makes assumption and when he lies. William remains passive as the 2 monks who were accused by Bernard Guy were convicted because he assumes that there's nothing he can do to help. William's will, no pun intended, is completely overshadowed by Guy's profession of the truth in that moment. It's this moment that goes to show that being overly pious or too committed to the truth is a fault. Some characters' overcommitment to the truth is exactly what leads them to do horrible things, because their truth is twisted by their shame. To bring it to the modern world, imagine texting someone and not hearing back for hours. It's easy to assume, if you're on the socially anxious side, that they might hate you or never want to talk to you again, but all of that is just a projection of your shame. The social anxiety, the shame, is exactly what causes your perspective to shift toward unreality. What just as easily could be happening is that the person was busy or just didn't see your text, but we always look at the data in a way that supports our worldview. If your worldview is that you should be anxious around people, or that people aren't trustworthy, then you'll take the data that supports that worldview. If you have shame, then when someone doesn't text you back, it's not because they were busy, it's because they hate you, even if that's not true. So the only thing that we do know is that we know nothing, and truth is just a tool used by shame to twist our view on reality to do things outside of our conscious control. So that's what we realize here at the darkest point of the story, that we can never know for sure what is right and wrong, and the moral atrocities that are committed both in the story and elsewhere are completely incomprehensible and unjustifiable. Wow, what an awful realization. And honestly, if that's where we stopped, I would be completely unsatisfied. But no, we need to go deeper to find the antidote to all of this absurdity. Shortly after the beginning of their investigation, William and Adzo hear about an argument that took place in the scriptorium about laughter, more specifically about a lost book, the second book of the Poetics of Aristotle, in which Aristotle discussed comedy and laughter. The monks in the scriptorium were arguing whether or not Jesus laughed and whether or not they should use laughter and comedy to teach the scripture themselves. This argument became very heated, as some thought of laughter as a sin, while others found it perfectly acceptable, and come to find out that the murder victims were all present during this argument, and we begin to have our suspects. One side argued that laughter was a tool for the common people to distort reality, and that Jesus didn't need to use laughter to teach the scriptures, and neither should they. And comedy, in their eyes, was an unsophisticated language used by peasants. The other side argued the opposite, that laughter could be used to see the world in a truer lens, and by laughing and using comedy, we actually look at things more closely and come closer to truth in an indirect way. Clearly, this argument on laughter is an integral part of the story, but why? Well, I have a quote directly from William that explains it perfectly. The murderer feared the second book of Aristotle because it perhaps really did teach how to distort the face of every truth, so that we would not become slaves to our ghosts. Perhaps the mission of those who love mankind is to make people laugh at the truth, to make truth laugh, because the only truth lies in learning to free ourselves from insane passion for the truth. Both Bernard Guy and the murderer believed excessively in finding the truth, so much so that it blinded them. William takes the opposing view. It's actually what makes him such a good investigator throughout the story. Unlike Guy, when William arrives at the Abbey, he doesn't just start throwing around accusations. He takes only what is really known to him and admits that everything else is only speculation. He does his best to solve the murders, but until the end, he doesn't know for sure who the killer is. There just isn't enough evidence. But because he doesn't rush to conclusions, he ends up being the only person to actually solve the murders. The only thing anyone else does is falsely accuse or be useless or worse. This quality that William possesses is something that we could all learn to emulate. The original reason I was searching for a mystery novel was because I was looking for someone who represented how we should challenge ourselves to become better, how we should use our egos to uncover ourself. For many characters in the novel, a lot of who they are is hidden to them. Shame appears when this is the case. When there are parts of you that you don't understand, you push them down and become ashamed of them. Like I brought up earlier, Guy might not even be aware of his sadism. In his eyes, he might be acting in the most respectable way, but we know he isn't. The murderer also views religion in this way, that it needs to be professional and perfect and serious. But by trying to be this way, both Guy and the murderer are turning a blind eye to everything imperfect about themselves. And the second you start ignoring something is the second that it has control over you. William isn't like this. When he decided to turn away from being an inquisitor, he questioned himself. He asked, is what I'm doing right? And if it isn't, why? He has this dialogue with himself, and not only becomes an investigator in the real world, but also an investigator of himself. This has so many benefits that are evident just from the person William is and what he's able to accomplish. He's able to free himself from the impossibility of being perfect and finds the murderer in spite of being imperfect. And above all, he laughs at the fact that he's imperfect. The unfortunate truth about being human is that we are imperfect. And as much as we might try to fix our imperfections, in the end, there's just nothing we can do. And the more we try to fix, the worse it becomes. William laughs at this too, this paradox I mentioned earlier. The more we try to force something into existence, the more we just make things worse. I think this happens to us because there's too much to examine that already exists anyway. There's so much already there to find, so much to discover about ourselves, so much to discover about the world. William finding the murderer represents this. He didn't need to force any information that wasn't already there, he just examined what was already in front of him. And he was able to do this because he had examined himself so long before the events of the book. Guy, instead of taking responsibility and analyzing himself, which is a hard thing to do, instead makes it somebody else's problem. He falsely accuses people to indulge in shame indirectly. After all, it's a lot easier to blame someone else for what's wrong with you. The better we know ourselves, the easier we can navigate the world. When we confront our shame, our assumptions about ourselves, we can finally begin to uncover the world and find out what's true and what's really out there for us. And that's really what shame is, an assumption about ourselves. There's a part of you that, whether you know it or not, you've assumed is imperfect, or unworthy, or unsophisticated, or as the monks in the book might call it, unsaintly. But this assumption is groundless. Even if you have data to support your shame, say you did something in the past that you're ashamed of, then the fact that you have shame about it now proves that you want to move on past it. But if you take yourself too seriously and don't learn to laugh at what you're ashamed of, then you'll be stuck in your shame forever. A continual process of self-loathing that keeps you down just because you're letting it. And that's it. We're ashamed and ridiculous, but we must laugh. Horrible things happen in the world, but we must laugh. And the inability to laugh at our own shame and the incompleteness of truth only leads to darkness. The world might be imperfect, it might be meaningless, but in the end, we can laugh at all of that too, and maybe become something higher than an animal, something worth telling a story about, so that others can laugh too. And that's pretty much that. Thank you everyone for watching, especially if you made it this far just listening to me ramble. I plan on doing more of these book reviews in the future. I know my upload schedule is not great, but you know, don't look too far back in those videos. I found this book incredible. When I read it, I was just astonished at just how deep it was and how many things it was so able to cleanly discuss in the length that it was, even though, yeah, the book is long. But still, it is still very good. I don't think I've ever read a book this long without any moments of agonizing pain, but here we are. The title of the novel, by the way, just like doesn't even make sense if you were wondering. The Echo said once that it was like because the rose is, well, I have a quote, because the rose is a symbolic figure so rich in meanings that by now it hardly has any meaning left. And I don't know, man, that's just like perfect to me. It's like completely brilliant with all of the ideas with truth in the story, and I don't know, like even searching for meaning in the title, it's like there's no real truth to be found in a way. Like that's, I don't know, this is awesome. Anyway, please go read the book if you're interested. All of this is just what I got out of it, but I'm convinced that somebody else could read it and take out something equally as important. And also, again, thank you for watching, and as they say, bye.